Hello and welcome to the third and final webinar for this family violence consideration for parenting plan evaluators. Again, my name is Michael Saini and I'm from the University of Toronto in Canada. And in this third episode, we're going to be covering the impact of violence on children and families and looking at the indicators that are important for evaluators when assessing the long-term and the short-term consequences of violence. And we're going to review some of the latest research and talk about how, as evaluators, we need to make sure that we are systematically and in a comprehensive way ensuring that we are fully evaluating all of these considerations and that we are being clear and concrete in our assessments, our evaluations of violence. It's assumed that being exposed to violence is negative, but that's not sufficient for us in our evaluations. We need to be clear about which indicators we are referring to, what evidence specifically is present in a specific case that suggests the negative impact of violence. And so hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to point out to specific factors to consider when considering the overall impact of violence on children and families. All right, so let's get going. So this is part 3, assessing the impact of family violence on parenting and children. And this webinar focuses on assessing the impact of family violence on parenting and child well-being in custody evaluations or parenting plan evaluations. And it emphasizes the importance of considering the safety of the child, the potential for ongoing abuse or coercion, and the psychological effects of exposure to violence. We're also going to be talking about how best to integrate the symptoms of family violence and the signs of family violence, those indicators that I was referring to, into the work of evaluators making sense of violence in the context of making recommendations regarding the best interest of children. So the learning objectives for this third and final session is to understand the impact of family violence on parenting and child well-being, to consider the safety and the potential for ongoing abuse, and then the last learning objective for this third session is to integrate the signs of family violence into our work. So when we look at the impact of family violence at the family level, we're again looking at our definitions from session 1, considering all the various forms of family violence. Again, remember, family violence is an umbrella term, and under that umbrella term, there's many other considerations. So physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, coercive control, legal abuse. We also talked about pet abuse. We also talked about child maltreatment. So it really is an umbrella term that includes all of those forms of violence. So the first we want to do, of course, is define, and then we want to be able to screen and assess, which we've talked about previously. And then we need to consider direct exposure and witnessing and intervening and being used as a weapon. So how has the child been involved in the family violence? Are they directly the target of the abuse? Is this child maltreatment or neglect? Have they been exposed? So there's been intimate partner violence in the home and they've been a witness to it, or they've been exposed to it, or have they been directly brought into the violence and used as a weapon in the middle of this violence between the parents. So we're going to be looking at impact on child development, looking at attachment, trauma symptoms, and again, it's because of the work of an evaluator, we're not going to be able to necessarily do a full um, uh, uh, consideration of trauma. We're not doing a trauma assessment. We're not going to be able to assess attachment patterns, but these are important frameworks for us to be thinking about when we're looking at the overall impact of violence on families, because we want to make sure that we are theoretically considering the impact of violence, as well as what are the indicators specifically that we're noticing from our evaluations. And then we also want to look at the impact of violence on parenting capacities, both perpetrating and victim parents. And I know I've said in the last session that we should avoid these terms of perpetrator and victim, but I'm using these for clarity, and so I'm just as we go through this information, but know that when we use these terms, we need to do so we're not labeling in a negative way, that we're not overgeneralizing or pathologizing people as being for example, victim parents, that as a non-offending parent, they may be survivors of violence. And so the idea of victim um, suggests that they're still haven't been able to be resilient or adjust or protect themselves or protect their children. And so there is this notion of a pathology of being a victim. And so I use that language here as a way of distinguishing, but just know that there's sensitivity around the use of this language, and we're using this language just as indicators, not as labels. So the impact on parenting. Well, one, um, violence generally can disrupt a healthy parent-child relationship. And we're going to talk about some of the research about this. And when you look at it from an attachment perspective, there's not a lot of negative impacts in one's life that can disrupt a previously secured attachment. So attachments generally from birth to, as Bowlby talked about, from cradle to grave, are usually stable. 70% of the time, they're stable. So if you have a secure attachment as an infant, you will grow up having secure attachments in your couple relationship. However, there are indicators that can disrupt the attachment. And one of them is the presence of violence. It's experiencing violence. So violence can make or contribute to a disorganized attachment, a fearful attachment, even if you had even if you had a secure attachment. And so this can disrupt pair bonding, and can disrupt parent-child attachments, and can disrupt overall sense of self and sense of other. And so it can really throw people into a different way of interacting, including with their own children. And it's important that we don't re-victimize the victims for having this attachment disruption, that we understand from an unresolved trauma perspective or from an attachment perspective what may be happening here. And so if there are these indicators, then we're looking for a lack of coherence in their narratives. We're looking for a lack of linear ability to tell a story about the relationship. And these are indicators that if there has been violence, that it may have had a disruption. We're looking at relationships before the violence, during the violence, and after the violence to look at overall patterns. We also know that being exposed to, being involved with, being a victim of can influence a parent's capacity to parent. It's difficult to be attuned to your children when you yourself are under threat and you're dealing with the stress and anxiety of having to make parental decisions. And this can be exacerbated by the context of the violence. And so we want to make sure that we're not, in our parenting plan recommendations, putting situations in place, putting recommendations in place that would further aggravate these situations. And then the other impact on parenting is just overall role modeling, exposure to unhealthy relationship dynamics and conflict resolution as children see this and are exposed to this as young children, and they grow up and they then take on, or they can take on, or mirror what they've observed, or can be negatively impacted by this. And so the role modeling of an unhealthy relationship can have a negative impact. When we look at children's exposure, the term exposure replaced the notion of witnessing. And this was done because there was a recognition that you don't need to witness the family violence for it to have an impact. That exposure is much broader. It's more of an umbrella term for children's impact of violence. And that exposure can include hearing a violent event, witnessing a violent event directly, intervening, and being part of the violent event and experiencing the aftermath of violence. And so we need to think more broadly. It's not just about whether the child was present in the room, but whether the child has been exposed to either directly or indirectly. So, for example, in one study, half of the victims who had the children in the home during the incident of domestic violence report that children witnessed the violence. So 50% actually saw the violence occurring. But those who did not actually witness the violence also had negative impacts from that violence because of the way that violence impacts caregivers and the aftermath of violence on parenting and on children's overall sense of security. And also, just because you're witness to or not witness to does not mean that you've experienced the violence any differently. So the parents may think that the child is not witnessed because the child is up in the room. Meanwhile, the child has been awoken by the violence and is now in the room, scared of what is happening down below. So they're impacted. The parents just don't know that they are a witness to the violence. So children's awareness of violence when there is violence in the home is actually quite high. And children often not only disclose violence in the home where the parents think that they're not a witness to, but they also disclose incidents of their own abuse in these situations. And so they get brought into the violence either being weaponized by one parent or asked to take sides. And so we really need to be attuned to the impact of violence and how much children are aware of the violence. So middle school age and teenage children are finally attuned to fairness and see through abusers' justification. And so they can spot power tactics at play. And so even if they don't see incidents of violence, they may still see patterns of violence. And Callahan and others found that children recognize that subtle controlling behavior. So again, these patterns of violence, and so they notice when these patterns are being used on both the victim parent, if you will, and the children themselves. There's also an overlap of family violence and so when you look at child abuse and IPV, for example, and there are several critical factors that need to be considered when we're looking at IPV, and one of them is that co-occurrence of violence that is directly against the child. In one study, they found that they were 4 times more likely than in homes without such violence to have experienced exposure. And so that is a really important consideration because the co-occurrence of child maltreatment and IPV is strong. And this has been shown in various reviews and meta-analytic studies, so studies that are taking a bunch of other studies and then looked at the results across studies. Spencer, for example, confirmed that men who have been violent in their intimate relationships have a higher level of general anger and hostility than men without history. And that anger and hostility then is also an indicator or a risk of child maltreatment. And studies have found that these traits have greater overactivity and more rejection in parenting, and then higher rates of anger and hostility are more likely to contribute to the co-occurrence between IPV and child maltreatment. So you need to look at the links of anger and hostility and how that gets played out into parenting, and then how that then is more likely to turn into a form of child maltreatment. And so you end up with this co-occurrence. Perpetrators of violence have been described as parenting differently from other parents. They often mirror the coercion and domination of their spouse in their parenting practices. And so you need to be able to tease out when there's been concerns around family violence in the IPV form. You need to be looking at, well, what does this look like, both in terms of exposure and awareness, but also in terms of the co-occurrence or the possibility of the co-occurrence of child maltreatment. Because what happens, and we have a couple studies that look at shared parenting in the context of family violence. And there's a notion that, well, you can be violent towards your partner, but still be able to have regular relationships with your child. And that may be, but that should not be a link or a leap that one makes from the research based on some notion of parenting outside of the context of violence. Because of this co-occurrence issue, we need to be thinking about, it may be that because they have used IPV, that they may also be using other forms of child maltreatment, and we don't want to discount that prematurely. So it's important to consider this co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment, because even if there's no indication that the child who has been exposed to IPV has been themselves maltreated, there may be also exposure to siblings who have been the target of abuse. And so we want to look at this from a family systems perspective and look at all family members, not just the parents and then the child or children, but we also want to look at the impact that the violence may be having specifically on each child, and then consider those sibling dynamics. We see that there are times where if a child sees that a sibling is being victimized by a parent, they may feel guilty, they may feel unsafe, they may feel upset from the abuse, or they may even believe or view that the child is deserving, the sibling is deserving of that abuse to make better sense of the violence. And so that may be their way of coping. And so it's really important that we're looking at questions not only at the parent level about a violence, and not only at the child level around violence, but we're also looking at, have you, noticed this happening and to anybody else in the family? One question that I like to ask is, who gets in trouble most in the family? And that gives you a sense of, who may be, if not this child, who may be at risk within the siblings of being victimized by violence. So some special considerations for post-separation. So parents who engage in violence often draw children into the abuse. They may be used as pawns. They may be used as so-called weapons to try and get back at the other parent. It may be another form, of course, of control. And then parenting the victimized parent is often a focus of the abusive behavior. And so we need to be thinking about coercive control and how it gets extended beyond the relationship and into the family disputes in the courts. And we've mentioned the expansion of legal abuse as being a form of an extension that we should be considering. So how are they using the courts? How are they using the child within this dispute to further victimizing? So, for example, children sometimes get brought in as being so-called witnesses, and so they are asked to be interviewed a number of times by professionals. So they're brought into child protection, the police, the evaluator, the hospital, the doctor, the therapist, and they're trying to um, you know, use this opportunity to further the control by over involving the child in the legal dispute. So what's the impact of all this on children? Obviously, it's great. Obviously, if they've been impacted by violence, either because of exposed or directly involved, it's going to have a negative impact. And the research does document, there's been numerous studies, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and these have all documented the negative effects of exposure to IPV and also the exposure to maltreatment. And so if you have a situation where there's been family violence, where there's been IPV, where there's been child maltreatment, there's a good chance that you're going to see that the children have been impacted in some way. The challenge will be many times the impacts that have been experienced by children are not readily, observable. So, although children may have aggressive tendencies related to the violence, or may present with different physiological presentations, or exhibit higher rates of trauma, unresolved trauma. These are not always easily detectable by evaluators. And it's one thing to say the child has been exposed, but we need to be much clearer about that when we're doing evaluations. That's not sufficient to writing a report or to make decisions around parenting plans by saying the child's been exposed. Well, how has the child been exposed? What specifically are you referring to? What behavioral changes can you report that suggest that the child has been impacted? And this is where it can be challenging. I had worked with a child one time. It was clear the child was being exposed because they had clumps of their hair missing, because a way of dealing with the impact was to pull out their hair, and so which related, which resulted in clumps. But most times children are not that easily to detect when they are being impacted by violence, partly perhaps because of being exposed. They've had to protect themselves and bury that impact, and so it may not be readily available or noticeable. And so we really need to make sure that we are triangulating the data and our observations and our information so that we're able to make better sense of what impact means specifically, with details for the specific child. So again, parents usually think that children don't know what's happening, and therefore they don't think that the child has been impacted. And even though the majority of children do observe assaults, most times when we screen for violence, we are not screening at the child level. So what did the child see? What did the child feel? What did the child do when that happened? And so we don't have a good picture of the child in that incident of violence, and therefore we dismiss the specifics and instead make general conversations about the negative impact of exposure. But those general notions of harm are not specific enough for evaluations, and not specific enough to be able to pinpoint what are the specific impacts that we need to be considering for this child. So we know family violence is one of the most negative experiences that can impact the temperament of teenagers, and the trauma it brings may accompany them for life. So we know that there's both short-term and long-term impacts of violence. Our role as evaluators, though, is not to make these sort of general statements, but to go deeper into the potential short and long-term impacts and be able to clearly articulate these so that the court is aware of specifically what indicators have you identified, And then those then can be more specifically tied into how to measure success of any treatment option or any parenting plan option that you put forward where safety is paramount. And so how would we know that the child is no longer impacted by violence? What symptoms would no longer be there? What indicators would suggest positive change? And so we need to be thinking about operationalizing this notion of negative impact so that we can clearly articulate those considerations. And so the one thing we need to do is be clear about when we say risk of harm to children, what are we talking about? Is it exposure to threats or acts of violence? Or have they witnessed specifically these threats or acts of violence? Has there been an accidental physical harm? So were they in that space where the violence was occurring and um, they were harmed, they got hit, they got they got but it wasn't intentional, but they were part of the violence, or was it non-accidental, where they brought in, is this where the co-occurrence of violence occurs? So was there child maltreatment, or was there neglect? Was the child upstairs and left to themselves because of the violence downstairs? Were they exposed to homicide or abduction? Was there undermining victim and healthy parent-child relationships? So were they impacted by poor parenting or rigid or irresponsible or neglectful parenting? So what was the risk to the child involved? And then we move into what were the effects specifically? So was there a change in their academic performance? What about problem-solving skills? Were these impacted by the violence? What about behavioral problems such as aggression, phobias, insomnia, low self-esteem, depression? Are they regressing at all? Do they start soiling their pants, even though they were potty trained up until the point of the escalation of violence? Has there been changes in children's development or developmental emotional needs? Are they less able to emotionally regulate? And so we need to be clear about these specific effects. Here's a whole bunch of other ones that we're looking for: anxiety and depression, persistent fear, sadness or hopelessness, unresolved trauma, flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety. Behavioral effects can include anything from aggression to acting out. So are they punching other kids? Are they getting in fights at school? Are they backtalking the teacher? Or are they withdrawn? Are they more isolated? Are they spending time alone on the playground? Has there been evidence of excluding themselves from social events? Are they having academic issues? Are they declining in their performance? Are they having difficulty concentrating? Or are they hyper vigilant about their school? Is that the only thing that they feel that they can control in their world, and therefore they are hyper vigilant on getting those grades? And then what's more challenging to try and figure out, what are the long-term consequences? And part of this is bringing in what we know from the research. We know that there's chronic health problems. We know overall, if we don't address the exposure of harm, that there's going to potentially be an increased risk of mental health disorder and physical health issues, that there will be most likely challenges in future relationships, and the intergenerational transmission of violence will mean that they're potentially more likely to be abusive in their own future relationships. But as an evaluator, we can identify that these are generally long-term consequences. We are unable to predict whether or not these consequences are specifically tied into this specific child, and that this child is more likely to experience these long-term consequences because they've been exposed to violence at an early age. Theoretically, from the research, we can generalize and say this is a risk, but we cannot say it with certainty. One of the challenges of indicating the effects of violence on children, and this is really important for parenting plan evaluators, is that the effects, as we just talked about, both externalizing, so the aggression, and the internalizing, the feelings of isolation and depression, for example, increase with time. So the more that children go untreated for being exposed to violence, the more likely that this will increase in terms of internalizing problems over time, where there's a 40% increase for externalizing problems and 117% in this one study of 74 longitudinal studies of violence, of increasing, and this is important, 10 years after assessing IPV exposure, which means that what you are observing today in terms of the impact or the effects of violence on children can be more challenging to try and articulate. And this is why we have to triangulate. This is why we have to observe. This is why we have to really make sure that we consider all aspects of child's development and impacts, because some of these will not be fully pronounced till 10 years later. So right now, it's really difficult to assess what is the impact because it hasn't fully developed into a negative problem and won't until many years later. So as I said in the last slide, we can't predict that they're going to be more negatively impacted 10 years later. However, this research is an important study because it includes 74 other studies. It's a meta-analysis, and they have found that these impacts are not only long-term, but also increase with time, and therefore more challenging to see in the here and now. So children's adjustment, again, because we're dealing with the long-term consequences and we're trying to predict or at least suggest what may happen in the future, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. If we see impacts currently, then we want to make sure we articulate those. When we're looking at future impacts, long-term impacts, so yes, I just showed you, out of those 74 studies, there's an increase of exposure and an increase of negative impact over time. But we should not discount other more positive protectors. So you can have exposure to violence, but still be resilient. So we don't want to pathologize children and say, because they've experienced violence, that they will be certainly impacted negatively in the future. There are many factors, and these are protective factors that you'd want to consider when considering the potential impact for current and also for long-term considerations. So the child's age, their developmental status, when the abuse or neglect occurred, the type of abuse, their frequency, duration, and severity is really important to consider. And then the relationship between the victim and the abuser, and any cultural and social context. So we want to look at those considerations, and we also want to look at these specific factors when we are thinking about parenting plan evaluations, because these would suggest how to put in protective considerations. So severity of violence, can we, in our recommendations, reduce the severity or the potential for future violence? The chronicity of violence, the child's perception. So what's the child's perception of what's happened? Don't assume that they don't know what's happening, because we know from the research that we've just gone over that children are very aware and probably have much more awareness than we perhaps consider them to have. And so let's ask them about violence. Let's ask them about how they felt and how they feel now. If there's been any co-occurrent abuse, how has that impacted their overall situation, and how can we address that aspect of the equation so to limit the overall impact? Are there alternative adult role models who are not abusive, who can be supportive, who have been supportive? And do they have a strong and positive attachment to at least one parent? And this can be challenging because we know that being a victim of violence can have an impact on one's attachment pattern. And so you could have a secure attachment and then be involved in an abusive relationship, and that can have a negative impact on your attachment styles, where you go from secure to insecure or to fearful, disorganized, and then that can have an impact on your own parenting. And then looking at community supports and how to put those supports in place to make sure that children are receiving the services that they need. So how to go about making sure that we are being concrete and explicit and detailed in our assessment of the impact? Well, one, we want to gather comprehensive background information, case studies, prior incidents of violence, any protective orders. We want to obtain information from a variety of sources. We're looking to triangulate these sources to give us an impact on those dynamics of severity and type and overall impact. In our interviews with children and parents and collaterals, we want to make sure that we are accounting for family dynamics, that we're accounting for protective factors, that we're accounting for opportunities to be resilient, but we're also ensuring that we are understanding what is the impact of that violence on specific individuals. If most measures of violence screen for violence at the adult level, it means that the majority of the time, children's exposure to violence, the impact of violence is theoretically assumed, but not specifically gathered. And so we want to make sure that we gather that information to find out from the child's point of view, what's their impact? What's their story about the violence? How do they make sense about the violence? How have they experienced the violence? How have they protected themselves or not protect themselves? And what attempts have they made that have been successful and not successful? We want to observe interactions. So parent-child observations as part of the evaluation isn't just for looking at overall parent-child relationships. We're also looking for potential signs of fear and discomfort. So we're looking at proximity to each other. We're looking at under any undue influence. We're looking at any opportunities that may indicate that there's impact of violence within these relationships. We have a paper on the ecological validity of home observations or just observation visits generally. And the idea of having structured and unstructured activities is important because this can bring out some of this discomfort. If they're doing like a game or something that they need to play, that you've asked them to play. And so you see how they go around the board game and you see how they negotiate or they don't negotiate. And so some of the parenting practices come out within those structured activities. You also need to assess the psychological and behavioral impact. And doing so, you could use standardized assessments to evaluate mental health of both parents and children. You could observe changes in behavior. You could look at, for example, report cards and look at teachers' reports of the child over time, look at grades over time, look at medical records, not just an overall statement from the doctor, physician of how the child's doing now, but how has the child been doing in the last couple years. And you want to then extend out your data points so that you can look for those any patterns that you may be finding in that information. So you're looking at risk factors for continued escalated violence. So if there's the potential for future violence, you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of that. And of course, as we mentioned last session, the predictive validity of these measures are not great. And so we need to be thinking about which factors are more likely related to the potential for future violence. And so we're doing a lethal violence assessment. We're looking at the potential for future violence. We're looking at perpetrators using, litigation abuse and furthering the coercive control, or the attempts to control the process. We're looking at the various typologies and how these typologies of violence, what is present in this family situation, how these may predict, although we're not very good at predicting, but we're still trying to figure out how to predict future risk. And there's going to be a large margin of error there because we can't be so specific in our predictions, but we can talk about the future risk of violence and the need then for proper safety planning and protective measures for both children and victim parents. So how do then, taking all this in consideration, how do we integrate the science of family violence in our work? Well, one, as we mentioned previously, using validated multidimensional screening tools is key. And it doesn't replace practice wisdom, but it is a combination of a standardized tool and practice wisdom, and also what the parents tell you and what the child tells you, the children tell you, that provides a triangulated, comprehensive way of screening for violence, which then increases the likelihood of being able to understand both the present or the past occurrences and also the future potential for violence when you combine all of those different data elements. You want to identify any power dynamics that are being used. So how is the court being used? How are you being used as the evaluator to either further promote power dynamics or promote an agenda that is trying to suggest perhaps a minimization of violence, or perhaps it's the other way. Maybe it's using this evaluation as a way of trying to um, uh, escalate the potential. And so you're having to assess. And we have an article on gatekeeping and how these evaluations can be used as a form of gatekeeping the child's relationship with the other parent. And so we know that false allegations are rare. And so when that occurs, we definitely want to take into account of those false allegations. But we don't want to assume that just because it's a custody dispute, that it must be false, because that would be an error. That would be a generalization of custody disputes that are not supported from the research. So when there are allegations, we need to take these things seriously, and we need to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to triangulate and to look at all information and then make careful assessments based on the information that's in front of us. So we want to triangulate by considering all sources of data, all sources of evidence, interviews, records, risk tools. And with all that information, we then want to come up with an overall comprehensive plan. We want to make recommendations that prioritize safety. Safety needs to be paramount. And sometimes it means including supervision, or sometimes it means including limits on access in decision making if there's the potential for future violence. And we need to be addressing safety as being a priority so that we can limit the impact of future violence on children and parents. And then addressing the impacts of potential trauma. Is there a need for trauma therapy, or at least a trauma assessment? What is the impact? And that can be really challenging if we have not done a trauma assessment. So perhaps one of the recommendations when there's been issues of violence and there remains unknown impacts of violence on the children is to suggest for a trauma assessment to get a better understanding of the potential impacts. So here are some common signs of family violence that should be integrated into the evaluation. So one would be any direct reports or disclosures. The moment that one person says that I've been abused by the other, that is a flag for you to start thinking about violence. And so you screen for every file, you're screened for violence. And I've mentioned before in a previous module, the two-level approach. So a two-level approach could be in your intake form, you have questions around violence. Has either parent experienced violence? And you have a whole bunch of, or you have like, not a whole bunch, but you have like, 5 or 6, 10 questions around potential past violence or occurrence of violence or current violence. And then that would be your overall screen that you would do with everybody, because that's part of your intake. And then if any of those turn up to be yes, or an indication of the presence of violence, then you would do further assessment into the specifics of violence for that specific family. You're also looking at behavioral signs. So even if your first level of screening shows up to be no violence whatsoever, it may be that parties are being told by their lawyers or others not to disclose violence. And so you may be needing to look at other considerations just to make sure that you are doing your due diligence around these issues of violence so that they are properly screened. So you've screened it in your intake, it shows up nothing, but you don't just say, okay, well then violence is not an issue. I'm just going to exclude that from my assessment. You're still always on the lookout for the potential for family violence. And so when you interview children, you're looking for any behavioral signs, hypervigilance or fear. You're looking at potential impacts of trauma reenactments in play. So if they're down on the ground playing with their toys and one is beating up on another animal, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think that that is indication of trauma reenactment, but it is a sign that you'll want to look at. You want to triangulate that with other information. So you're always looking for what is considered to be normal child development and what may be considered as behavioral signs of being impacted by violence. When you get police reports, medical records, you're looking to see if there's any evidence in there about previous violence, both in terms of specific incidents of violence towards the other, but also any pattern of violence. So, for example, you may have a parent who has been arrested for being drunk at a bar and fighting others. So they have an assault charge. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily involved in abusive behaviors with their ex-partner or have been in the past, but it is more likely that those patterns suggest more aggression and less ability to mood repair, and therefore puts them at risk of being involved in family violence. So you're looking at any adult victim signs of previous unresolved trauma. So you're looking at how they have experienced previous relationships and how they have experienced violence in the past. So it's not only about whether or not there's been violence in this situation. Have you ever experienced violence in your life? And that gives an indication about their overall experience with violence and how it may be impacting the current situation. We're looking at for any examples of power and control dynamics in a relationship, where one partner may be intimidating, isolating, denigrating. And so even though they may not have described these controlling dynamics as being abusive, they may not have a definition of family violence as we do. And so they may not experience family violence per se, but they will have experienced these control dynamics. And so therefore asking about these gives you a better picture about the potential for family violence in language that is more relatable to what they may have experienced rather than the definitions of family violence that we are coming in with. And then we're also looking at any parenting deficits or any undermining authority. So we're looking at the co-parenting relationship, the parenting dynamics, how have they experienced these relationships. So they may say that there's no power and control dynamics in their relationship per se, but then when they get into how the other parents the child, they then may move into explaining what may be considered to be family violence. And so we're triangulating these different ways of understanding of family violence, and we're connecting what they're saying to what the research says about family violence and about these broader definitions that they may not articulate, but still may, in fact, be exposed to the risk of violence or have been exposed to previous violence or been a victim of previous violence, even though they don't see it within that definition. And then we're looking at the risk factors that suggest continued concerns for the future violence. So threats, stalking, threats made to abduct the child. And so we're looking at the potential for future violence as a way of considering what safety precautions need to be made in these parenting plan evaluations to make sure that safety is paramount. And then the impact on children, like the emotional behavioral issues that we've talked about, and any parent-child relationship problems need to be sorted out. But again, knowing that these may not be specifically visible and may not be coming out in terms of being impactful until years later. And so how do we document the impacts of emotional and behavioral issues? So we need to be clear and make sure that we talk to teachers and talk to coaches and talk to others involved in the children's lives to really understand how the child is coping and any changes in the child's behavioral makeup is so important, so we can document those as being potential indicators of the impact. Again, the bottom line here is that simply saying the children are negatively impacted by violence because the child has been exposed to violence isn't sufficient. Theoretically, you're correct, but you're not helping to understand how one should be considering the impact of violence and how that should be considered within parenting plan recommendations of being able to measure future improvements. And so being clear about what is it specifically are you concerned around the impact? Is it the child's behavior problems? And if so, what specifically are those behavior problems? Is it educational specific? And if so, what is it about how the child is doing at school that suggests the child's been impacted by violence? And so the more we can be clear about those indicators of violence, then the more that we're able to put in place specific suggestions about both impact and then how to address those specific conditions to alleviate the impact of the child's exposure in short and long term. So some of the key messages here to wrap up. One is the safety and well-being must be paramount. Whenever we do parenting plan evaluations, the number one focus should be to protect children from any form of violence or exposure. And yes, children's relationships with both parents are important generally, but we want to be careful of the false equivalency of safety and time spent. We need to make sure first the child is safe, and then if the child is safe, then we can look at the parenting time, because there's no sense putting children in harm's way for the sake of being false equivalent, suggesting that time is as important as safety. And when we look at protecting children from harm, we're looking at not only the physical, but also the psychological impacts, and both in the short and the long term. And we're going to be very clear specifically what we are referring to when we say impacted by violence. Do we see elevated levels of anxiety, depression, unresolved trauma? We need to be very clear in our evaluations what those potential impacts may be, and what are those, and how are those impacts having an influence on how the child is coping or adjusting within the specific context, and then how can parenting plans specifically address safety, and impacts. So we need to be able to recognize the signs of family violence. We need to be clear about the behavioral and psychological and behavioral indicators. We need to be clear about what we mean by signs of family violence. There are those that are obvious and those that are not obvious, and we need to make the ones that are not obvious more more specific, more measurable, more operational, so that we can make better sense of the signs and we can articulate these and educate these to the courts about what specifically are you concerned about. And then how does it get tied into parental capacity? We know that being abused or being a victim of violence does have an impact on one's ability to parent. And so we wanted to make sure that we are not pathologizing or blaming the non-abusive parent for not being able to parent in their best way. But instead, we want to look at what are the supports that need to be put in place to help that parent be better able to take on their parenting responsibilities, despite also dealing with being abused by the other person. And how do we then consider a plan that best addresses this? And also for those who are acting in violence, how do we again create a paramount focus on safety and invite them to be accountable to the acts of violence and then take measurable steps to address those so that they're no longer considered to be a threat and that their parenting abilities can be better addressed so that they're better attuned with the needs of their children. This is, again, my contact information, and if you have any questions or any thoughts about what I presented, I would love to hear from you. Please don't mind reaching out to me, and here's my email here. And I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to document these three areas of family violence. We've talked about definitional issues. We've talked about screening, and now we've talked about impact. And I hope that you've enjoyed this time and that you've learned something from this information. And I look forward to seeing you at a conference, or make sure you say, hey, I saw your video, just so I have an idea of its potential reach. So thank you very much for being part of this, and thank you for this opportunity.